welcome. I am so grateful that on a Friday morning you are coming to learn about law. Operationalizing law. You know how hard it is to get people interested in this topic, except that there is so much happening right now, that there is a flurry of activity, and it's very, very hard to figure out what matters and then what to do about it. So today what I want to do is walk you through a few parts. We're going to start a little bit higher level, and then we're going to get really operational, okay? So the idea is that we can, I'm sure I'm going to trip over this at some point. The idea is that we can contextualize what the trends are and really understand why the trends are there before we look at what is happening to actually operationalize those trends. Because the thing about the law right now in particular is that it's super fluid. So there is a lot of discussion, but there isn't actually much that has been approved. So it's being all codified in writing, but it hasn't actually been passed. So there isn't a ton of new law that is applicable. But we know where the law is going, and we know what we're worried about. And so if you've ever heard me speak before, you always hear me get to the very fundamentals of, here's what I care about, and here's what I don't care about. Here's what I worry about, here's why, and this is what I'm doing about it. So the first thing we're going to talk about is exactly that. What am I worried about? I have heard amazing presentations through this wonderful conference about the excitement of artificial intelligence, and I believe in all of it. I have for many years, and I'm excited to see what the potentials look like. But it doesn't mean that there aren't things that are specific with the use of this technology that makes us worry. And I use worry not as a legal term. I actually use worry just in a sense of what are we protecting against. So in the world of AI, what becomes distinct at law is the fact that you have this inorganic being, this inorganic system that is breaking the chain of causation. So I'm a litigator by training. I spent the first 10 years of my legal career defending some of the biggest companies in Canada. I'm from Canada. And in so doing, I got to see what it looks like to sort of mount a big defense against class actions, against individual plaintiffs, against other companies. And so when I came into the world of AI, that's exactly the mindset I brought. How do you defend against different claims, and what could those claims be? And so for me, the biggest thing is trying to understand who do I point the finger at when I think something has gone wrong, or when I'm anticipating that something is going to go wrong, and I'm trying to write it into the different contracts. So when I talk about AI being unique because it breaks a chain of causation, it means that it becomes harder and harder for me to point the finger at an individual, and that's what the law is protecting. The law is not protecting general issue. It's trying to protect the relationships that we form, how you govern those relationships, and then what happens as a consequence of not governing those relationships appropriately. So when you have something that is inorganic, that is self-learning, that is operationalizing certain actions without necessarily the involvement of an individual, you can see how the law is going to struggle with that. Because it becomes harder and harder for me to say, it's your fault. You'll say, it's not my fault. I didn't do it. The machine did it. It learned on its own. It was a distinct data environment. It has nothing to do with me. Okay, well then whose fault is it? Someone's going to pay for this, and I need to figure out who. So we worry about the those kind of strict principles. And then we also worry about the human impact. So with these systems that are harder to point the finger at, that are highly scalable, and that can have really significant consequences on individual rights and freedoms, we worry about what's going to happen if we don't govern this. And you've heard this a lot in the news with the CEOs of the top AI companies being called into the president's office for a discussion about what some of the risks are. We're worried that individuals that are already being discriminated against will be discriminated against further and on a scale that is unprecedented. We're worried that students will create deep fakes about their principles and scare the living life out of everyone that has access to this, the democratization of that tool. We're worried about the fact that personal information is going to be used in a manner that you can't touch anymore because it's collated with a big model that nobody can see and understand. We're worried that there are significant cybersecurity risks, that we're going to create these systems that we can't fully understand and that are vulnerable to a cyber attack. I mean, we're worried about cyber attacks on many different levels, but this introduces a new reality. And this isn't just true for governments. This is true for businesses. This is true in each and every one of your organizations where, whether you know it or not, they're all using these free AI tools because they're interesting and they are helpful. And the issue becomes, how do we create a framework around interesting, helpful tools that might cause risk to our reputation, to our legal position, to our regulatory position? How do we create a governance structure around that enables us to maximize benefit and minimize risk? Then we worry about the existential. And I don't want to spend very much time on this, but I will tell you a little story. So this is Dr. Jeff Hinton. He's really considered one of the godfathers of neural nets in particular. His research was instrumental in shaping AI as we know it today. And Dr. Jeff Hinton, I heard speak back in 2018 in a room no bigger than this. And what he was saying then was, in response to a question about general artificial intelligence, and I distinctly remember this, what he said then was, yeah, it's so far off, it's not even within our lifetime. So in my head, I always thought, great, that's one less thing to worry about. Since my world is shaped by things I have to worry about and who I can blame, this was one less thing I had to worry about. Cut to 2023, where he says, the idea that this stuff could actually get smarter than people, a few people believe that, but most people thought it was way off. And I thought it was way off. I thought it was 30 to 50 years or even longer away. Obviously, I no longer think that. This is upon him resigning from Google so that he would have the flexibility and freedom to go to the world and warn the world of the existential threat that he saw with AI as it is today. So we have this in the back of our minds as we try to legislate and codify actions to minimize the risk while maximizing the benefit. Because the other thing that Dr. Jeff Hinton said at the time, and I believe it was his wife that was going through breast cancer, he said, we could solve this. We already have the cure to this, but it's sitting in some massive data lake, or it's sitting in a sort of fragmented set of data that we can't access and analyze because of policy reasons. So we've got these amazing benefits combined with an existential risk. Okay, so now that everybody is as worried as I am, and hopefully as excited, because I did preface by saying I've spent this conference listening to amazing things that are happening, and I'm excited by it. Let's talk about what is responsible AI, and why should I care? And more importantly, what do I do about it? So let's start with principles, okay? We always have to start with principles so we understand. Now we know what we're protecting against. And now let's understand what are the guiding principles that are going to ultimately be codified that we ultimately have to operationalize. So there's a little bit of a butterfly effect when it comes to the law. And these OECD principles are really emerging as the dominant principles that shape what AI law is looking like. And so if you look at the principles, they're pretty motherhood, like they're pretty high level, but they are super important as you deconstruct them. So number one, it's that AI should benefit people on the planet by driving inclusive growth, sustainable development, and well-being. So this, to me, if I have to deconstruct this, this means I have to look at the impact on humans, the impact on, generally speaking, I'm taking a very broad definition there, and the impact on environment. And we know that these massive system servers are highly energy consuming. And so there is an environmental question that is actually becoming a much more dominant debate. The second principle is that they should be designed in a way that respects rule of law, human rights, democratic values, and diversity with appropriate safeguards. So when I deconstruct that, I think, okay, so human rights law applies to AI law. I know that existing principles of rule of law need to apply. Due process is a good one. Can I demonstrate that something has been fair as much as I can ensure that the outcome is fair? And then, am I mindful of the impact, particularly on enumerated groups that have suffered historic discrimination, for which we are not, we're conscious of perpetuating ongoing discrimination at scale. So that's how I deconstruct principle number 2. 3 is there should be transparency and responsible disclosure around AI systems. So to me, that means I have to tell the world what I'm doing. And in addition, I have to tell individuals who are interacting with certain systems how these systems may impact them. 4, these systems must be robust, secure, and safe, continually assessed and managed. This tells me about my accountability structure. So this is already starting to tell me I need to be able to assess for safety and security. I need to be able to demonstrate that they are being continuously monitored, which means I have to understand what's the intended use of the system, and is it being used appropriately, right? And then I have to be able to demonstrate that the system is continuously following the guidelines I assumed it would at the beginning, or I've adapted my system and my structures accordingly. So that's what it tells me. And then the last thing is that AI systems should be held accountable for their proper functioning. That organizations and individuals developing, deploying, or operating AI systems should be held accountable for their proper functioning. So what this tells me is there's going to be enforcement somewhere, and it will be as against organizations who are deploying, developing, and using. So this means there are 3 stakeholders that are being implicated in law. So these principles that feel very motherhood actually start to give us the construct of an AI governance framework that's super important. Okay, so the principles then that we typically organize around are privacy. We have existing law on privacy. It is a very complicated landscape because in the US you have sort of mushrooming privacy laws at the state level, a lot of talk about a federal privacy law, and then you have sector-based privacy laws. You've got health, children. So privacy is very important. In one of the earlier slides, you saw the FTC is moving against OpenAI in an investigation for the use of their personal information. I get this all the time. So I've got this great idea. My company wants to do this. We want to use AI for this purpose. Can we use the data? And I was like, I don't know. We have to go back to your privacy policy. We have to go back to what you told the world you were going to use the data for. Did you tell them you would use it for algorithmic training? If the answer is no, then you probably can't. You probably have to find another way to be able to mobilize that data. Just as a small side, I want you to see the world of privacy the way I do, which is very simple. It is, and I explain this to my 7, and you know how they say explain it like I'm 5? Well, I explain it like they're 7, because that's what my daughter is. So I'm like, privacy is no different than a playground promise. It's playground politics. It's when your little bestie says to you, I've got a secret that I want to tell you. Or actually, better yet, your little bestie says, I hear you have a secret. I want you to tell me. Here's what I'm going to do with your secret. Here's who I'm going to tell. And I swear, pinky promise, I'm not going to tell anyone else or do anything else with that secret. And so your bestie, says, okay, fine, I'll tell you my secret. As long as all you do is with that secret what you told me you were going to do with it, and tell the people you told me that you were going to tell. And you're not doing anything else with it, right? Pinky promise? Pinky promise. All right, secret's told. But that means you cannot change. Because if you do, you've broken the trust of your bestie, and that can be really hard to rebuild. So that is actually the fundamentals of privacy law. And when you think about it in the AI context, it is no different, even though the promise can be outstanding. So we also worry about bias and non-discrimination, as I discussed. We don't want to perpetuate ongoing bias and discrimination at scale. We have seen this in many examples. We have seen discrimination against many, many groups, and it's very hard to determine how that discrimination is taking place because these models are so complicated. So increasingly being baked into the law is a bias assessment. Now, it's context dependent, but that's what's being baked into the law. Principles of safety and robustness we've discussed. Same with transparency and accountability. I'm going to stop for a second. Are there any questions?
So in privacy law, sometimes we mention that the data might be used for quality and training purposes. Does the training talks about the model training, or is it just the human training?
Yeah. So the question is, oftentimes in privacy policies and in privacy law, we talk about whether data may be used for quality and training purposes. And the question is, does that include algorithmic, or is it just human training purposes? And I think it really, unfortunately, this is the answer that so many lawyers give, it really does depend on what the sort of promise is, what the reasonable expectations are. So would it be reasonable as an individual user to assume that my data is going to be used for algorithmic training because of other context, or not? Is it completely, it might be an infrastructure group, right? That has a privacy policy that governs only the use of the data on the website. And so you wouldn't necessarily assume that an infrastructure group that has like a very storefront policy is using my data, whatever that may be, for super fancy algorithmic training. You wouldn't necessarily. That's just an example of a context that might not fit. But at the end of the day, it's about truthful disclosure, so meaningful disclosure, and then to an extent, it's your argument, right? It's like what can you point to that you say makes a fair disclosure to that individual for algorithmic training? And we are all going to get creative with this. I've gone down that road many times where, people are like, just turn yourself into a pretzel and tell me how we can make this work. And I'm like, okay, this will be fun. And it usually is. So it really does depend. But I think your point is a good one, which is look for every little piece that you've got and see if you can string together something that sort of meets that reasonable expectation threshold. Yep. So the question there is, typically there's an exchange where you get somebody to consent, and in a context of a healthcare agency, for instance, where people have to provide data, what do you do to obtain that consent? Is that a fair? Okay. So healthcare is super interesting because it depends what you're getting the data for. So if it's in the context of research, you would go through an ethics board review or an IRB here. If it's in the context of a healthcare app, then you would put clear disclosure to be able to access that data in a manner that would be used for some kind of other purpose. The key thing about privacy law is that there is the primary purpose that you identify. So I'm going to use your data for the purposes of quality and training. And then there are secondary uses, which is, well, now that I have this data, I just came up with a new great idea, and I want to use it. Privacy law typically, generally as a principle, will say, well, you can't do that without going back and getting consent. But it does depend on the jurisdiction. I will say that. It is very jurisdictionally dependent. So let's just level set for 2 more seconds on the law, which is what we are seeing in the world of AI is that there are different categories of sort of legal development. The first is a sectoral base, meaning you've got a law that is emerging that will govern the use of AI in the employment sector. Law that is emerging that will govern the use of AI in insurance. This is a big one that's coming down. And that's really, coming down, bubbling up, same thing. Or in surveillance. A lot of concern around the use of facial recognition technology, understandably, and how that would be used in surveillance contexts, whether retail, public sector or private sector. We're seeing both. The next is something that is more application-based. So New York City, I find this remarkable that New York City would come up with a law that requires notice and disclosure and a bias assessment for the use of automated decision tools in the recruitment and hiring process. There is a whole regime that is now put in place, that is in effect, that is requiring that at the city level. So if you had any worry, if anyone's looking for a career, I'm telling you, the AI law is a great place to be, because if we're going to govern city, state, federal, and internationally, there's tremendous complexity that's coming down the pipe. Then you've got more of a one-size-fits-all, which says, I'm going to govern artificial intelligence technology. It is a sweeping cross-sectoral governance or law that will apply to the technology. And that's what we see happening in Europe. So the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, which you can anticipate will be the GDPR of the future. GDPR, if you're not aware, is the sort of European privacy law that came into effect in 2018 and has become the gold standard for the world. So the world sort of followed GDPR, California being a notable example here. So we're anticipating the same happening in the world of artificial intelligence, a movement to meet the standards of the EU AI Act, because you cannot sell in to the EU market or develop high-impact or high-risk AI systems in the EU market without passing a conformity assessment and getting a stamp of approval. So it will shape the way all of us operate in that market. And it is prescriptive. So it will cover the different roles, develop, deploy, use, and it covers the life cycle of the AI system. So I always break it down into my buckets of data, model, and then outputs. It covers that life cycle on an ongoing basis. And then ultimately, we're also looking at what I sort of consider proxy laws. So privacy law to me can be a proxy regulatory framework for artificial intelligence, because you're regulating the inputs, right? And then you'll be looking at the outputs from a human rights law perspective, or a civil rights law perspective. So you've got proxy laws where you're governing by the use of existing laws in order to protect existing principles, but in an AI context. International trends are really important. So the first is we've seen huge advances in AI and machine learning regulation. There is not a day, literally not a day that goes by where another senator, a new senator comes up with a statement, or a new regulator comes up with a concern, or a new state comes up with a draft law. And if you just scroll down sort of to the third last bullet, you'll see a nice comparator. It's out of date though, which is the 117th US Congress. So this was 2021, was the most AI-focused Congress in history, except for what you have right now. I just don't have the number for 2023, where 130 AI bills were proposed as compared to just one in 2015. So if you look at that huge change, this sort of level of activity is catalyzing. Another big issue for this is not only advances in the technology, but the amount of data that is even more available post-COVID, where we all went online, we all went digital, and the sort of available data just exploded. And then you've got a lot of activity happening around the world. So this is the other thing I just want to convey. This is not a regional movement or one country or one sort of conglomerate of countries that are regulating. It is happening slowly all over the world. And I just read this morning that now Taiwan is proposing its own AI law. So what we really have to do is figure out what are the trends and how on earth are we going to create an AI governance program for global entities. So if we're moving across borders, how do we create a program that we could actually operationalize, but that will meet the requirements of different jurisdictions? And that's why I want to start with the OECD principles, because those seem to be quite dominant around the world. And so we're going to align our program to those principles. There are also a number of really important standards that I want to draw to your attention. There are standards, I would say NIST has come out with their AI risk management framework. If you haven't read it, please do. It's a worthwhile, voluntary, self-regulatory framework that helps to establish sort of not only, if you look at the framework itself, it's very high level. I would look at the playbook. The playbook actually gives you specifics around objectives and then ways to operationalize those objectives, or sort of benchmarks for operationalization. And the idea is you very much choose what works for you, give it a try, and then iterate. So there are something like 72 objectives, or I'm trying to remember the exact number. And the expectation is not that you're going to operationalize 72 different objectives, but you're going to cherry pick the ones that make sense for your context and go ahead and operationalize your system that way. The other one that I'll draw to your attention is ISO, an international standards organization that is coming out with a management standard and has a series of technical standards. And the reason I'm sort of flagging ISO is because from everything I hear, the ISO standards and what is coming out of Europe they're trying to harmonize as much as possible. So to the extent that you can harmonize with some of those existing standards, you'll also hopefully be well set up if you are entering or thinking of entering or operating in the EU market for when the EU AI Act comes, which we are told will happen by the end of the year or early 2024. So not that it would necessarily be in effect, because law after passed needs a period of time for compliance, but it will be, we already know what it says. It's had broad acceptance now. It's gone through lots of different readings, lots of amendments, and so we can already start to align to the extent that our organization needs to. You'll see the risk areas that we've talked about. So this is where the standards, you get some sort of guidance from the standards and ways of addressing this. And that's what we're going to get to next. I just want to be mindful of time. Okay, I'm going to stop for 1 second. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
1 second, I've got a mic. Just for the virtual folks. Thank you. You're welcome. I promise I'm intact. The playbook that you talked about in terms of standards on AI, I was just curious, is it by a certain organization? Or
NIST.
Just, okay, nice.
It's the NIST AI Risk Management Framework playbook. So when you go to the NIST website and you look at the AI RMF, you'll see that there's a link to the playbook, and there's a lengthy playbook that sort of helps guide you through the process. And they're very big on profiles right now, so if you do operationalize it within your organization and create a profile, you can submit it to the NIST library, and that will help them iterate on what they're doing.
First of all, this is really, really informational. I really love the topic we're talking about. One thing made me think is that if you look at the attitude or the policy between EU countries and us, it almost feels like EU is leading the way in terms of care about human beings. If you think about their policy of work overtime, they have laws to not allow people to work overtime. You think about the GDPR, they're the first one care about who is storing their data, again, in AI as well. But US is more of ask for forgiveness. Do you see that in other type of laws, or do you see that, to me, it's just kind of interesting who really care about the people and their data?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so as a litigator, I always take the opposite. It's like I'm contrarian by nature. But I'll tell you why I think that there is a different argument. So what many will say is the EU is regulating high-risk systems, and they have created a pyramid of risk that they say identifies prohibited AI systems, so you're not allowed using them. Then you've got this high risk for which there's a distinct governance structure in place, and then you have low risk for, it's sort of like a set and forget, okay? And what a lot of people say is, in so doing, because that high-risk system covers finance, employment, healthcare, surveillance, law enforcement, education, a lot of people will say, in so doing, you're stifling innovation in a way that is actually harmful to humanity. There are other ways to protect humanity without having an onerous and cumbersome regulatory requirement. And that, in fact, by creating something that is so onerous, you're actually harming small and medium-sized businesses that can't afford to comply. The big businesses that are actually the ones you're most worried about and frankly are always after to fine, you're not getting at them, right? So that's, I think, what the sort of counter-argument would be. But certainly what I see is that there is sort of a consistency in principles. And so whether you're prescriptive, so the other thing you have to appreciate is the EU is mainly civil law, which is very codified, whereas Canada, the US, UK, we are common law. So we are comfortable working off principle and precedent. And so when you see it in that context, you think, Well, we've got the principles, and now what we have to do is set up the right framework to support compliance with those principles, not prescriptive. That's sort of itemizes what you're supposed to do. And I'm sympathetic to that argument because, I think you can codify it, I think you can put it into law, but there is something to be said for principle-based and risk-based versus overly prescriptive.
Hey, Carol, going back to your comment around the activity in Congress right now, and without commentary on any of our political affiliations, how concerned are you that all these rules and regulations and governance is being set forth by people that potentially really have no solid understanding of AI?
Yeah, so this is an issue around the world. Policymakers, when they enter, we always say, bad facts make law, because that's the only thing that ever gets to court. And then are policymakers really the best place to regulate? I think, we operate with the systems that we have. And I know that there has been a lot of concern about the level of education. If we bring this actually into the context of our everyday lives, there's something to learn from that, which is, and it actually might segue nicely. Yeah, it sort of does. So, which is that the digital literacy component, whether it's internal to an organization or certainly for policymakers, that digital literacy component is super important and cannot be undervalued. So we need to start educating people on what is this technology, why is it great, even though I didn't start there, that really is a really very important message. Why is it great? Why will it be incorporated into everything we're doing? So we were talking yesterday, and we were saying, I was talking to somebody who was about to present to their board, and they said that they wanted to come out with this whole presentation around, ethical AI. I said, okay, that's great. I said, you know what? Start by telling them why this isn't a should, it is a must. We are going to be using this technology. So now now that we've accepted it, we have to figure out how are we going to do it responsibly. What does it mean to do this the right way? And that digital literacy component is super important. So being able to educate your boards, your executives, your leaders, your managers, your staff, why they should not be afraid, they should go ahead with adoption, and that there is a process in place that will facilitate smart, responsible use of technology where needed, not just for the sake of it, but because it actually solves a business problem. That to me is a really great starting point, and I say it's whether it's policymakers or it's internal.
One of the things I want to ask is, we are seeing more focus on the laws around AI, but we've been using AI for a long time. Is it because the exponential growth of data and the adoption of AI, what has caused us to focus so much on the laws now?
The thing that has caused us to focus on laws more and more, so first of all, these processes have been in place, slowly growing over years. So what is culminating now is sort of a rapid movement to start writing and passing. And part of the reason for that is that the functionality and the sort of commercialization of AI feels bigger. So there's more we can do. It's being sort of adopted more rapidly. And so this feeling, and frankly, it really does have to do with coming out with GPT and this notion of, are we getting closer to a form of technology that is smarter than us? So I sit on the OECD Policy Observatory for AI, and I was there in April. And one of the researchers from U Berkeley that's very close to one of the Microsoft researchers working on GPT said to us, I asked this Microsoft researcher if this is AGI, or general artificial intelligence. And the researcher responded, I don't know, but it sort of feels like it, so I can't say it's not. And the Berkeley prof's response was, you can think what you want, but this is somebody who's right in the center of it, and you can't discount at least that sort of spidey sense. So I think that's really what's catalyzing, which is, I was likening it to climate change the other day where I said, for years we've been talking about the threat of climate change and what should we do about it. And then it's not until we have record-setting heat across the world where we start to think like, we have to do something as of yesterday. And that's sort of the feeling I'm getting in the AI space, which is for years we've been talking about its potential. And it's not until you start to get that spidey sense where it's like, this technology is actually starting to potentially get to a point where we can go down the road of it getting away from us, that we start to say we should have legislated yesterday. So what you have here is taken from the ISO standard, but it provides a really nice structure for AI governance, okay? Now, when I use the words AI governance, I want you to think about what you did internally within your organization to comply with GDPR or comply with cybersecurity standards. It is a process for ensuring that you've got oversight and that you are thoughtful about how you're using this technology, and you can importantly point to things that say, this is what we did, and this is how we did it. These were the decisions we made, and this is why. So being able to create that structure hits on transparency, accountability, and then those assessments that demonstrate that you are complying or attempting to comply with privacy, civil rights, and other existing laws. And so what you will find that is a little bit new here is this concept of an impact assessment. And I want to spend a minute on it, even though we're going to get to it a bit later. I'm going to be conscious of time. So the impact assessment is what is being rolled out to help us determine, it's like a threshold assessment to determine whether this AI system is likely to cause harm to individual, property, psychology, environment, and if so, it will be subject to governance. If not, if it doesn't hit that high impact threshold, then you can set and forget. Because you don't want to govern everything every time you use a system that falls within the extremely broad definition of AI. You only want to govern those systems that could potentially cause certain harms. And so this is really important, because when you start to hear about governance, you hear about it as a sweeping thing, but that's not what it is. The law in particular is governing only those high impact and high risk systems, okay? So first step, what do we do? The first thing you do to start designing your governance structure is to assess your internal maturity for responsible AI. And so you have some examples here of what you should do. We like to break it down, as many do, across people, process, and technology. But you'll see that, for people, a lot of it is on talent, identification, retention, digital literacy, and training. Culture is super important. Understanding your culture, your corporate culture, and figuring out how to align your sort of data ambitions with that culture is super important. The next is process. So you will set up certain governance structures that we're going to look at. In high impact contexts, you may have an entire stakeholder engagement strategy that you are either required or advised to undertake. Required because some of the laws are saying that or draft laws are saying you will need to engage stakeholders from certain groups. And then others are saying, well, this is just a best practice. Consider if and how you want to do it. And then obviously technology being able to look at the strategic alignment. Don't use AI just for AI's sake, just because it's cool right now and shiny. Like, figure out what is the business problem you are trying to solve. Is there a technology that will make it easier, better, more efficient? And then you can start to incorporate it into your plan. Next, we're going to actually talk about certain responsible AI artifacts. So this means things that you can start to draft and create already to help you roll out an effective responsible AI process. So the first is that we talk about an acceptable use policy for AI. And what that looks like really practically is being able to give guidance about how and when you can use certain systems and when you can't. So this, when you're talking to your risk and compliance group, or you're talking to your technology group, this is where you're going to want to sit together in a multidisciplinary conversation and start to unpack what are the dominant sort of applications that we're going to be adopting. I get a lot of questions about ChatGPT right now, And then what is the process that we're going to set in place that says, here's when it's acceptable to use it, and here's when it's prohibited, okay? 2, it's setting up an AI working group or some kind of AI oversight committee. The purpose of this committee is that you are trying to establish where there are sort of oversight requirements. So you've got a high impact system. For example, I've got one client that is in the content creation stage, and they came up with a very, very cool system that would help make pictures very easy to manipulate. But the idea is that there would be good reason for it. And what they found is that in consulting with the AI group that they have, what they found was that there were some members of that group that identified that the system was actually erasing facial tattoos, because the system assumed a facial tattoo was a bad thing, that it's a lack of clarity. And somebody I said, well, actually, culturally, this can be really significant for people. Like, there are cultures where facial tattoos are very significant. We should not be predetermining this. And so they were able to, by using this AI working group or this AI ethics review group, they were able to identify that as an issue and address it before public release, thereby lessening any potential reputational harm to the organization and a potential human rights claim for creating a system that erases culturally significant features. Training and education, a whole program around that, and I've got some ideas. And then starting to unpack what your AI impact assessment looks like. There are some examples out there. ISO is coming out with a standard around AI impact assessments, but there is no one impact assessment to use. So you're gonna have to draw from different sources and consult with your AI working group to establish that impact assessment that is most relevant to you. In addition, you're going to want to set ongoing monitoring and control processes for those high risk and high impact systems. So who's monitoring? What are they monitoring? What are the controls in place? How often are they reporting? And to whom? So those are some of the really practical considerations you're going to put in place. There will be transparency, notice, and disclosure requirements. So what are you telling the world about what you're doing and when? In particular, if you're operating a high-impact system that is interfacing with consumers, you're going to need to tell them, or you may want to tell them, that they are speaking to a chatbot, or that they are speaking with, or they are being influenced by, or decided by an AI system. Because that gives them the sort of information they need to redress or seek recourse if they disagree. Vendor due diligence. If you are on the vendor side, there are a whole bunch of things that you will want to put in place to demonstrate that you are complying with these standards. And if you're on the buyer side, the procurer side, you're going to go through a whole procurement process to be able to demonstrate that you've asked the right questions when it comes to bias assessments, impact assessments, monitoring obligations, IP, intellectual property, and then liability. So certainly there's a lot to unpack there. And as one resource that I'm aware of, so I think NIST has a resource center that has some stuff for procurement. The World Economic Forum does as well. You can find some resources specifically on AI for procurement. And then testing of AI systems for bias. So whether you are, in some cases, so if you take the New York City example, you might be an employer using these systems. You're the one that actually bears the legal obligation, even though it's your vendor that is best placed to undertake that assessment. So you just want to be really mindful of how you're going to be setting yourself up for various assessments, particularly bias assessments that are sort of getting the most attention right now. And then third, you need to implement these RAI artifacts. So you're going to want to create, what I've done here, we've provided some ideas of what would go into an acceptable use policy in terms of scope, definition, assurance mechanisms, and then roles and responsibilities. And we've also provided sort of a sample table of content. We have the AI working group, and we've given some ideas as to what would go into the mandate. So you want to be able to show that there is sort of a place for discussion the working group has a requirement to review policies and procedures or create them, that there's clear reporting obligations, and then you'll note here that it is very multidisciplinary. The idea is not that like tech is leading it, or privacy, or legal. You all have to sit together, speak the same language, and start to develop a process to ensure responsible AI. Some ideas for modules. So we've got, what we have found is that when it comes to training, there are specific things that a lot of organizations struggle with. So we've developed a little bit of a curriculum around, if you're doing a general training across the board to the organization, what you might want to put into that training. As well as for the impact assessment specifically, what are some of the questions you want to be asking as you go through and devise your impact assessment. So what are the benefits? Then what are the reputational, regulatory, and legal harms that might come to bear? And then how are you valuing those harms? So that you can establish what your sort of impact metrics look like and then create a risk mitigation plan against those high impact systems. For ongoing monitoring and process, we're really thoughtful these days about who is touching some of these systems. So to what extent do you have human involvement? This is important from a liability perspective. It's also important from an accountability perspective. So you really want to think about not only the structures, but how involved is an individual in sort of interfacing between the output and the sort of end user. And we've provided some examples of what questions to ask as you develop your transparency notice and disclosure processes. And then finally, for vendor due diligence assessments, there are some specific questions that you want to be asking. The other thing that if anybody is on the legal side here, we are seeing more and more AI addenda or addendums for, that are similar to the data processing addendum. We're seeing something similar for AI, that is specific called out requirements for systems that appear to be high impact. So that you're asking about the data sources, you're asking about the various assessments that may have been undertaken, you're asking about audit rights, you're asking about IP, intellectual property, and then you are clarifying to the extent possible liability obligations. Super important that you, if we don't have law that's going to tell us who's at fault, try to contract it. And with that, and very short time, I want to turn it over to Regan, who is not only the co-founder of this entire conference, which has been awesome, but also putting in place a separate company that is assisting organizations in specifically sort of building out their playbooks for an AI governance plan. So, being able to take some of those artifacts that we talked about and then putting them in one place where you can start to operationalize and track it so that you can demonstrate. I mean, the big thing for me is always, how do you demonstrate what you've done? How can you prove you did it? I'll end on one note, which is in litigation, we always said, if you did it but didn't write it, you didn't do it. So try your best to document and then organize. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to use a handheld. Hi, everybody. That was a smooth transition.
Thank you.
Thanks. Barely noticed me plugging my laptop, right? So, yes, as Carol mentioned, we've been talking for, over a year about this. I am a co-founder and CEO of Align AI. We have a booth this year, which is really exciting. We help companies build, adopt, and govern their policies and procedures for data and AI. We just launched our product. I won't talk about it too much, but if you want to see a demo, we have one running. But what I will talk about are some of these concepts. So I think one of the biggest problems is that we end up talking about a lot of these concepts and have a really hard time figuring out how to tactically operationalize them. And so what we're focused on is kind of these four different areas of operationalizing a new capability in this space. So at the bottom layer, you can see concepts, and then you can see frameworks, and then roles and tools. And I go in this order because usually when we talk about implementing something new, we We start with concepts, so education, great. We have like data camp licenses and, Coursera licenses, and those are fine, those are great. She mentioned a bunch of frameworks, which is awesome. So through NIST and ISO, that's great. She also mentioned roles and responsibilities, which is great. And then tools. We love focusing on tools a lot because we think that they're going to bring all the other things along with it. And that's rarely the case. I used to work for a tooling vendor that did ML ops for a number of years. We would help banks deploy models at scale and manage risk of that. And I would go into an account. We would show them the tool works. There's lineage, there's metadata, but they didn't have literally anything else figured out. And they couldn't use it. And it took them months and months and months and months to try to adopt it and transform it. And so that's why Brendan and I, my co-founder, started Align AI, because we knew that that was a significant problem. People were not focused on the bottom layers there. And I'll try to make this a little interactive too. Maybe we can do some exercises. So concepts, why do the work? Frameworks, what is the process to do the work? Roles, who does the work? And finally, how do I execute? And even, these three without the top one is really hard because we can all know and speak the same language. We can all follow these frameworks or have them in place or available, which I'm sure most of you are going to look them up after this, and that'll be great. We can talk about roles and responsibilities, which is always an argument at companies. And then the tool, without that, we can't really enforce it. So we can try to do this manually, which is usually step one, but how do we enforce it and do that at scale across an entire company, multiple teams? So I'm going to talk a little bit about AI alignment because it's important. And I think this concept is what a lot of people are talking about in terms of the ethical and responsible use of AI, right? So this is safety research that aims to ensure that artificial intelligence systems achieve desired outcomes. So Carol's talking a lot about desired outcomes. We talk about that from an ethical perspective, what are the values and principles as a company, but also what are the laws? And then ensuring is this governance framework. So how do we ensure? How do we know people are doing the right thing? I don't know about any of you. How many data scientists are in here? Great, a couple, love it. So, as a data scientist, earlier on, you're spending a lot of time basically building and making decisions on your own and creating assumptions, right? If you don't have a super robust mechanism to build models. And so there's a lot of creative freedom on what am I going to include, where is their signal, what sorts of features am I going to create. You might be working closely with a business or end user, but there's still a lot of human process in place. We are not at a fully automated end-to-end process, and I think that's one of the bigger challenges that organizations are facing. So this should be somewhat familiar to you if you're in this space, right? It's the machine learning lifecycle. And so we talk about business goal, ML problem framing, data processing, model development, deployment, and monitoring. It's not linear. There's a lot of iterative components to this process. But when we're talking about layering in these core principles into what we're doing today, we use a Jupyter notebook, or we log into Databricks, or we use Dataiku, right? These are like very tactical things that we are doing today inside of companies to build models, deploy them. We have a CI/CD, or continuous integration and continuous deployment process for our models potentially. So if you think about what do we have today technically to adopt and ensure this, how do we layer on some of these core competencies to that process? So what we do with our customers is basically create what we call templates or playbooks, which is like customized to the company. So we can grab something like NIST and we can say, okay, what does that look like for company X? What's our tech stack? What's our industry? What's our data look like? What types of models are we building? What's the regulatory compliance ecosystem, right? And we can start to layer in some very tactical actions that we can do throughout that process. So I kind of layered those around the side. I'm not going to cover all of them just because of timing, but decision mapping is something that we think is super important and something very easy to do that most people just skip right over, which I'll show some examples. Product requirements documents, I will touch that a little bit. Nobody loves documentation, I know that. I am going to push it a lot. Data quality assessment monitoring, as hopefully you've seen, it is in the data and the data quality, a lot of it. Model selection process, Can we use black box? Do we need transparency and explainability in order to audit? If we do, there's certain methods we cannot use. And testing environment, very important, getting that thing into production, it's hard. And then your control center and escalation process, which I've not seen a ton of non-super regulated organizations put in place. If you're at a bank or an insurance company, I'm sure you have you've got your 3 lines of defense internally from your compliance team. So you definitely have some of that in place already, or at least an infrastructure to add to. Okay, roles and responsibilities. She mentioned the collaboration points. I think this is usually where it breaks down pretty heavily. So we can outline all of this stuff all day long, we can do all of these activities, but if we don't have a central point, and I'm talking like an actual tool or an actual place that all of us meet and agree and sign off on things, this is gonna be really hard. So I just listed a couple, but legal and risk, really important. Nobody loves running to legal, sorry, Carol. But it is hard. Nobody loves running to legal and being like, hey, can you make my process harder of getting my model into production? You know, it's challenging. AI product management, big advocate, obviously, of product management, talked about it a lot yesterday. But the product managers are like, they can help quarterback all of this. And I think this is a role that just companies don't have, because there's a lot of people trying to quarterback this, but like product managers can do that. They can spend time gaining empathy for the end users in the system and understanding how we're implementing it, and they can coordinate a lot of these conversations. Of course, our data scientists, data owners, operational users, business stakeholders, we have to have a central place that we can all speak the same language, agree upon things, and when we're talking about policy, we're able to break it down into what matters for each of these individual personas. So she's talking about policy a lot from the legal perspective, which is important. But there's these other folks too that like, that's a foreign language to them, you know? So we want to be able to translate it, get it to a central point. So I'm going to talk about decision mapping. I'm actually using the New York City Local Law 144 that you were just talking about. So thank you for priming. We did not coordinate that, actually. So this is a very simplistic overview of that. And if I get it wrong, please say something. So decision mapping, this is like the applicant process. If you're a recruiter, right, you get candidates that submit applications. Those applications, you review them. They submit their resume. We did a recruiting session here. Some of them may use some of these systems. And then your applicant's interviewed and a decision is made, offer or pass. And there's a series of sub-decisions in each one of these things at a company today. Take AI out of the mix completely. And just to kind of re-emphasize what she was saying, there's already discrimination laws in place. So if a person is doing it, they can't discriminate against somebody based on age or race, right? So that exists already. So decision mapping actually has literally nothing to do with AI, but it's super important when you're building and designing systems with AI. Because what you're gonna do is automate a lot of those decisions with AI. And so where do we automate it across that process? And can we highlight or circle or identify some of those decisions that are high risk already? So how am I doing on time? What time is it? 10:19, okay, great. I have like 25 more minutes. So why don't we maybe take like a minute, write down, think of a system that you're using AI for today or thinking about using AI for today, and just do a quick like decision process map of what core decisions are being made along the way. If you have a notebook or a laptop, feel free to do it there and just kind of sketch that out. We'll give you about a minute. I'm gonna grab my phone so I can time myself. We're good. For the folks at home too, you can do this also. Don't want to forget them, you know? By the way, this is something a product manager would do, right? I'm just going to keep pitching it. See if people actually hire for a product manager for this. Okay, great. We're going to come back to this. So it doesn't have to be super extensive, but you can go back and kind of reinforce it after this. So product requirements document. These are pretty lengthy, or can be pretty lengthy. And when we talk about data or AI products in general, I'm just going to briefly touch on one section that we put in every single requirements document. When we work with customers, there is a section. We use templates. We customize it to them. But there's a section in there always, which is what information do I need to capture through metrics to be able to understand what's happening in that decision map at all times. So how do I capture data across all of that? So I'm going to use the recruitment example. So as a recruiter, if I'm just doing it manually on like myself, there's data I can capture about why we're passing on a candidate. What was the reason? We could put reason codes down. We could select them. We could add evidence to why that person doesn't match up with the job description. Right, there are things that we can start to capture over time. Then there's a warning. So what's our threshold? What are we nervous about? Like, how do we warn people that there's a problem? And there's an error, and that error needs to live somewhere. And so when we talk about a product requirements document for a product that uses AI, we want to capture every single piece of this. And the data scientists can help think about it in the terms of performance for the model, but it really is more so has to do with the use case. So really thinking through what information do we need to capture, and this can be driven by policy also. This can be driven by law. Maybe we know that in that process, we are going to have to comply to a particular policy. And so we need to be able to capture that, manage, and monitor it over time. So in a product requirements document, it might look something like this. This is drastically oversimplified. But we may have risk categories that we put down. So is it a financial risk? Is it an ethical risk? And you can, internally, you can work with your risk and compliance teams to see if that exists today, what sorts of risks exist or categories of risks exist. Your description of your risk, which is discriminating against protected classes when you're making a hiring decision. And this NYC Local Law 144 was what Carol was talking about, which basically, if it's an automated decisioning process, it has to have, detection for bias, and it has to be auditable. And so then we have a preventative measure of risk. So how are we going to measure that? And thankfully, this law is forcing those vendors who do that to have a bias detection component of it. But per her conversation, how do we ensure internally that that's true? Do we get access to certain information from the system that we can start to detect if there's an issue? Even on the decisions being made. Think about all of the hiring decisions that are already made. Can we start to look at all the applicants and hiring decisions that have already been made, even if it's by these automated systems, and start to look for trends or relationships between that ourselves, just as an extra measure of tracking it? What are our signals of risk? So how are we going to manage that operationally? And what's the quantified implication of that? This can be really hard to calculate, but she was talking about the impact calculator. And we want to try to quantify this to some capacity. So if we do have an issue, reputational damage is one. Financial damages by not being compliant is another. And then, of course, societal damages to individuals that are impacted by not getting a job because they were discriminated against. So, these are just some high-level examples of things that how would we calculate that? How would we measure that? And it's the idea of what is the magnitude of that impact and what is the frequency of that impact and how do we display that somewhere and quantify that to say this is high risk or low risk. So when we work with our customers, we include something like this in every single product requirement document. It helps with auditability. It helps to show that you've got some sort of foresight around that. And it helps to collaborate with legal a lot. I have one customer in financial services that uses this type of document or this type of playbook to collaborate with legal. They just kind of review. We can like detect and tag things as policies inside of a playbook, and they can review it, and they can approve it. So these are the types of things operationally that I think are super helpful. Awesome. And then we've got our control center and escalation process, which, as I mentioned earlier, more regulated industries have something like this, where you have an owner, an action, and an escalation. So for your owner, who's responsible for the first action of investigation? For your action, what is the first step in investigation or fixing the issue? And your escalation, who does the alert go to if the first owner cannot receive it or resolve it? So if you don't have this ready for your organization around AI, this is something you have to map out. And this is the roles and responsibilities piece. Things that you can think of: metric, threshold, alert, action, escalation process. We used to do this all the time for banks. They have to have it documented, and there has to be somebody available to address it if it is an issue. So I think the main point of this whole thing is a lot of this infrastructure exists. It just needs to be tweaked, and the collaboration points need to be more comprehensive than they have before. And finally, talking about rolling out capabilities, iterate fast, and optimize adoption. We talk about these kind of pillars: capture, share, and improve. Capture is what is our framework, what is our process, what are our tools that are associated with that. So framework's great, but how are we mapping that to operational tools inside of the company? Share, communities of practice, knowledge bases, examples, checklists. Do we have standard checklists before every model is deployed? Do we have stage gates in place where a model can't even go into the development process until it's been signed off on the design? Most companies don't have that. Our knowledge base, where does everything live? These SharePoint sites are really hard to navigate. I don't know if you have the same experience, but I do. So even if you document it, nobody can find it, which thankfully, like generative is getting better at helping us find and navigate documentation, which is awesome. However, there's still complexities to that. And generative can't help you if your documentation doesn't exist. That's a problem. And then examples and checklists, like do we have an easy mechanism for this? Like as data scientists or as software developers, we've created these really robust ecosystems to be able to find code and fork code and work off of those versions. We have not really done it for things like this, for like knowledge bases. And so I think that's a huge challenge that organizations are facing. Where's their single source of truth? How, as an associate or an analyst, can I access our policies as a company and understand them? And then improve is measure, feedback, iteration, governing, and auditing. And I skipped over communities of practice, but those are super important too. This is more of that like change management stuff that we were talking about yesterday. How do we get people together who are all struggling with this and get them to communicate with one another, continue to work together to make improvements to the underlying process. And that's super important. It needs to be very intentional. If you can define whatever his role is in those conversations, it's not yet another meeting. It's going to waste everybody's time. So just be very thoughtful about your kind of communities of practice and that collaboration point. So that's what I've got. Does anybody have questions? Great, and I'm going to run to you because I have the mic.
Thank you. Very relevant information at this time. I wanted to understand the bias detection a little bit more because we are looking for absence of bias or presence of bias. And like you said, the tooling doesn't exist. We are doing it all with policy. So how do we actually find out that the bias exists? Because what kind of data or signals we are looking for?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think bias, if you have the ability to understand why the model is making certain decisions, that's why these like large language models are interesting, but they're really hard to understand. And a lot of the times they're not logical on how they're coming to some of these answers too. So the logic helps. So for more simplistic models that you can use, you can actually have it tell you why it came to that decision. What feature is it weighing more than other features to come to that decision? Like a decision tree is the best visual representation of that, right? And so when you have transparency on that, you can start to say, okay, not only are we going to predict whether or not this candidate's a good candidate, but we're going to say, why did the model get to that conclusion? And we're going to, that's why the decision mapping was so important, because as a person, we do that already, but as a system, we need to also tag what was the leading reason that we did that. And that can help with some of the bias detection, because if that model is making decisions that are like, hey, it actually came to that conclusion because it really leveraged, I'm going to use an example, it's a bad example, but like zip code, right, which we're not allowed to use for things like that because they can be proxies for other attributes, then that's a problem. We can flag that. And before it actually makes a decision, we can say, this model was about to make that decision, but we stopped it because we have a bias detection check, or we have human intervention to review it. And we can look at that reason code and say, yeah, that's not ethical, we can't do that. And that might signal to you too that your design was flawed. Like, why are we even using zip code in the first place? Like, why is that even in our training data set? So I think there's certain things beforehand that you can start to look at. The other method I've seen organizations use is a separate environment that you run the model in, that you don't actually use the outputs for decisioning, but you create kind of a mock environment where the model is running in a somewhat production-like environment on real data, and the outputs aren't being leveraged, but they're being watched for like 3 months or 4 months. And you can start to see, oh boy, we would have really made some mistakes with these ones, what happened? And then you can start to say, all right, we've kind of ran it for long enough and we're comfortable with it, we can move it. We can start leveraging those outputs in an automated fashion. So there's multiple ways to do kind of bias detection and try to prevent that from actually happening beforehand, but you have to have the forethought to put that process in place as an organization and not just like ram things through, which I think is one of the biggest challenges we're experiencing today because everybody's so excited.
So when we ask a vendor that, give us the parameters or give us the features you are evaluating, we also need to have.
So in the decision map that you talked about, you said, we need to ask the vendor, show us your bias detection, right? So we are asking for the features they are evaluating, and then we have our own set of features that we do or do not want to evaluate against. And then if we are being really responsible, we mock it out, we test it out before we roll it out.
100%. That's exactly right. And for any vendor that's saying that's proprietary information, which a lot of them will, you may want to reconsider working with them or figuring out how they can give you enough information to give you peace of mind to move forward. And that's why the procurement process is so important, because we don't have a rigorous way of doing that today. Like if you sign an MSA with a large organization, they've got a big section on like NIST frameworks for data privacy that you agree to as a vendor. That doesn't exist yet. I haven't come across one that outlines NIST or ISO regulations and MSAs yet. Have you?
To an extent, that's what we're seeing with the addendum, where it starts to unpack that. So that's something that you're starting to see more and more. And then the one thing I would add is, remember that under New York law and under most of these laws, you need some kind of independent assessment. So to do it internally is not always good enough. You actually need an independent assessment, and you need to flow through. So as a vendor, you're going to do your assessment. More often than not, vendors are not collecting this information. People are not comfortable or permitted to collect demographic information, so you are doing an assessment by inference. So we support a number of clients that actually, with their bias assessments, not technically, we work with a group who does it technically, and that is one of the biggest issues, is that you're not always collecting that demographic detail, so you have to do it by inference, and then you have to justify where the impact, like what you're saying your system, what the impact ratio of your system is as a vendor, flow that through to the user, but remember, you as the employer or the user, you bear the actual legal obligation, it's not the vendor. So you'll be really thoughtful about your contracting, and then you'll be really thoughtful about what is the nature of assessment you're doing, which is why you want to bake in audit rights.
Yeah, I think another point is, I've got a good friend, he's an entrepreneur, he started a recruiting platform. and they're leveraging AI. And I talked to him, I was like, what are you going to do about this new law? And he's like, we don't automate our decisions. So that law doesn't really apply if it's not automated. I think there was a component in there that was like an automated component.
So yes, but it talks about whether there's been so much back and forth, but now it's if it has a significant impact or replaces the decision. So you have to be thoughtful about not only the nature of the decision, but then how it interacts with the actual decision-making process. And remember, this is not necessarily AI. This is an automated decision system, and law is governing. GDPR already governs automated decision systems. A lot of law already does. And typically, the issue you're always looking at, is it solely based? So is it that the automated decision replaced human judgment, or is it that it influenced human judgment? And there is a very wide spectrum in the law about how much human judgment needs to be influenced.
We're giving you a heck of a time on mic switches. Thank you. Yes, got another question.
First of all, as someone who works in artificial intelligence and machine learning documentation, I really appreciate the emphasis on documentation, so that was music to my ears. My question is about how to build an effective working group for governance. So my experience or my observation has been that the risk management and legal folks oftentimes don't have the subject matter expertise or the language to be able to effectively scrutinize AI systems, and conversely, developers are kind of, they're working in their own world and they don't have the language to to describe the model in terms that the legal folks and the risk management folks can understand. So how do you effectively translate between those two worlds? So how do you build a team that can really kind of have a common language?
That's an excellent question. I think the concept piece, I always talk about conceptual learning as speaking the same language. So if the training and education you're doing today does not achieve that objective, it's probably not very good. And that's why I think a lot of these generic kind of training mechanisms that people use, well, we have a license for this thing, go take this course, like they can be effective to a point, but they don't take that into consideration. And not all the parties are involved in it as well. So I know education is not the silver bullet, but it does give enough context to different personas to say, when I say this, you understand that I'm saying that. And that's why it's important to work with people like Carol and people who have like a robust experience on all the different domains, because they're not going to understand the context fully. And somebody that has that robustness that can come into the organization and just set it in place, I think is really important. I've seen a lot of companies do like day-long workshops where they're all in the same room and it's one full day or multiple days, and it's legal and risk and data owners and your data scientists, and they all hear the same thing at the same time, and they're all having a conversation, and they're like, oh, that's what you mean by this. So I think that kind of stuff needs to start happening. People are calling this like AI literacy or whatever you want to call it, doesn't matter. But those programs need to be thought through, and they can't just be, we have this license for this thing, go take this. It's just not enough. So I think that is helpful. And then I think structuring the type of collaboration points, like an exercise we did was, where am I going to be talking to legal ever? And what's the conversation and objective for those points? And then how do we facilitate that? Like, what's the frequency we're going to be talking to them? Is it a meeting? Is it a document review? Are they approving something? Like, just really, really being thoughtful about that like handoff point, and writing that out for all of the roles that are involved. What does that look like? And then I think that, and then get everybody to agree. Yes, that's comprehensive. Yes, that's good enough. Like, we don't want to add more meetings to people's schedules. I get that. But are there other ways we can do it? So that would be my feedback. And we've seen that work pretty well. I think I have time for maybe one more question. If anybody else has a question. 5 more minutes, great. A long question.
Thank you. How would a 10-year ago you respond to this level of documentation? or 15 years ago, or 5 years ago, just depending upon your experience. And I'm asking this because we've moved into agile practices so heavily, and the key is this isn't part of agile. This is kind of back to waterfall in some regards, right? You have to have frameworks, you have to have this, you have to have that in place. How are you going to marry these two ideas back together to make sure that we can maintain the agility, especially in a moment where we have so much change that's going to come through from a legal perspective?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, because 10 years ago, I was working with Brendan at these banks building out SharePoint documentation for waterfall because a lot of organizations really treat data science projects like waterfall projects because they're so research heavy that they are just like one big thing in the beginning. And then once it's ready for deployment, then they can start getting into sprints because then it's just like getting them all tested, getting into production, boom, boom, boom. That's what we've seen. So I actually think the nature of data science is kind of nice because a lot of organizations do struggle to apply agile methodologies to data science projects. In fact, agile is a triggering word for a lot of data scientists. They get so frustrated because there's like a certain amount of research that they have to do and understanding and feasibility of a project. So I actually think it buys you enough time to think through the design of that. And this can also be super iterative. It doesn't have to be a 40-page SharePoint doc. Like it doesn't. You can modularize this. You can start to create templates. You can start to fill things in where like most of it is already there. And now we're just like changing out a few things. So it's a great question because if you also know there's a lot of iterations on models that happen over time too. And we don't want to be stuck with the same thing. This is why a lot of regulated environments, they'll retrain a model maybe like once a quarter, a couple times a year. And sometimes that's fine and necessary and that's okay. But you know, they're just not willing to automate things or change things a lot because of how much time it goes into that. So I'm not going to pitch my product too much, but we're trying to figure out ways to make the documentation process much, much easier and faster. But it is a massive problem.
So talking about, so I'm a product owner now. So I just started this. I'm like listening to this. I'm taking down a lot of notes. But one of my things that went through my head is like, you mentioned like PowerPoints. One of our problems that I feel like we run into, I work at Huntington, is documentation is in all sorts of forms in all different places, and it's in coming from it like a programming viewpoint, it's in like a bunch of binary format. So there's like latest v1, latest v2, and so you get a bunch of these things. Like, are you seeing people move these frameworks into like Git, or in like version controlling their documentation in this way? Is that something that's happening, or you would think is a good idea?
Yeah, interesting question. Yeah, so I think that is the problem, that most of these things live somewhere in SharePoint, and they live in PowerPoint decks too, which is wild. But they do, because there's an educational component to it. So, people are doing like road shows, and they're going around the organization, and they're presenting out on these new frameworks and trying to get people excited and understanding about them. That's a piece of change management that's important. And so what we're seeing organizations do is trying to manage that. So there are some tools today that in the flow of work will allow you to document components of it. So that's kind of interesting. I have seen Git-like documentation. I think there's a company called Almanac that does kind of like branching and version control of documentations like that. I think they're smaller, but there's probably a couple of other ones too. But they are using Git as a like underlying framework of how to manage the knowledge base.
You find the source of truth and be like, oh, this is really what everyone should be looking at as the document, not the one on the shared drive.
Right. So he mentioned source of truth and being able to reference to that. Yes. And I think the more you can make it in the flow of work too, this is why I'm not picking on SharePoint or anything, but like this is why that's hard, because I have to leave what I'm doing and go to the system and find where I'm supposed to update it. Like it's so hard, and that's why people don't do it. Like I was talking to this data science leader at a conference last year, and he was like, we literally do sprints for documentation. Like that's their solution of trying to like power through it because they can't get this stuff down. And as you can see, that's one of the biggest issues.